25, go around climbing 3000.
Another loss of separation event between a Blackhawk helicopter and a regional jet in the Washington Reagan National Airport airspace. The NTSB has released a preliminary report on this latest May 1st incident. Let's go over it on this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. The NTSB has put out a preliminary report on yet another close call at the Washington Reagan National Airport between a regional jet and a military helicopter. And I'm traveling right now, so coming to you from a location somewhere in Colorado. And if this report sounds familiar, it's because the DCA midair on January 29th, 2025 is still burnt into our minds, where a military Blackhawk ran into a CRJ regional jet, killing 67. And now, as we get into the details, I do want to say this is nothing unusual. Inadequate separation, close calls in the airspace above Washington, Reagan over the past decade. From 2020 to 2024, there were 15,000 of these, according to the NTSB. 15,000. That's 13 a day average. With the tragic loss of those 67 lives, that airspace is under a microscope now, as well it should be. This means we're stepping back from the precipice of normalization of deviance for the FAA-controlled DCA airspace. But also, looking at the details of this NTSB report, if it wasn't for the midair in January, I doubt anyone would even hear about this one. All right, let's go through the report. The incident was on May 1st, 2025 at 2:33 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The two aircraft, one was a Sikorsky Blackhawk, but they don't have listed which model it was. Was it the older Lima model, like the one in the DCA crash that has limited instruments, or was it one of the newer Blackhawks with glass panels and better avionics? The NTSB report doesn't know yet. The other aircraft was a Republic Airways Flight 5825, which is an Embraer E-170. Call sign for Republic is Brickyard, because they were originally from Indianapolis. And they were on an approach for landing at Washington National Airport, DCA, for runway 19. And that's a south flow, which is the opposite direction as the midair in January when they were on a north flow. And that helicopter route, Route 4, that was used in the crash that killed the 67, that route's been stopped. So this was in a different area of that airspace, which we'll get into in a moment. And how close did they get? It was 0.4 miles laterally and 200 feet vertically. In the DCA traffic control tower, there were 5 positions being worked at the time. According to the NTSB prelim report, these positions were a local controller working both the fixed and rotor wing, and a local assist. The report says local assistant, but the correct term for ATC that they use is assist, not assistant. One person was working ground, another on clearance delivery and flight data, and there was a supervisor. Now, some people might point to the local controller working both airplanes and helicopters as a bad thing, but depending on the load, this is not unusual across the air traffic system in the U.S. The helicopter was PAT 23 and was inbound to the Pentagon's heliport from the southwest via helicopter Route 5 with the Pentagon transition. There were 3 airliners inbound to runway 19 at Reagan National. These were in order: PSA Airlines Flight 5073, Delta Airlines Flight 1671, and the Republic Airways 5825. At 2:21 p.m., PAT 23 contacted the DCA tower and requested to fly helicopter Route 5 to the Pentagon.
PAT 23, single H60, inbound from Springfield, request Route 5 to the Pentagon.
PAT 23, Washington Tower, Washington Tower 2, niner, radar contact right now, 1100 feet.
Confirm we're at 1100 right now.
3, roger. PAT 23, say your request one more time.
Route 5 to the Pentagon.
PAT 23, you said Route 5 to Pentagon?
Confirm, Route 5 to the Pentagon for PAT 23.
2 minutes later, the tower instructed PAT 23 to hold 3 miles west of the airport. The crew acknowledged and read back the holding instructions, and then 1 minute later, the tower instructed PAT 23.
PAT 23, proceed to Cleveland and hold.
Proceed to Cleveland and hold for PAT 23.
Okay, let's take a look at the helicopter map for the area. When they're in a north flow, like it was when the Blackhawk crashed into American Airlines Flight 5342, the airliner was coming up from the south and turns here to land runway 33. The crash on January 29th happened here. In this May 1st case, it's a south flow, and with all the highly restricted airspace around the White House, the Capitol, they can't move the airline traffic into the main and longest runway at DCA, runway 19, when on the south flow, they can't give it a nice straight approach. Instead, the airliners have to thread the needle right here, right by the Pentagon. And unfortunately, the Pentagon's helipad is located on the northeast side of the building, which is the closest you can get to the airliners that are threading that needle. The tower was dealing with what she thought was two airliners, so she asked Regional Approach to increase the spacing between those two airliners to fit Pat 23 in to go to the Pentagon.
Currently the traffic is at 2.5-mile final. After that traffic, I'll get you.
But the Delta flight got thrown in, and I'm not sure why that wasn't planned for, which we'll get to shortly. At 2:25 p.m., the PSA Airlines checked in with the tower controller on the river visual approach to runway 19. Now, for those non-pilots, let me explain how the airspace in a congested area like a major metropolitan city works. The airspace, generally about 30 miles in diameter, centered from the big airport, is controlled by a regional approach called a TRACON, which stands for Terminal Radar Approach Control. TRACON is talking to the aircraft and lining it up for the approach to the airport. Then they tell the aircraft to contact the tower. And after an aircraft establishes contact with the tower clears them to land. In the event that the tower has to talk or coordinate with the TRACON, they generally have a shout or a dial line to call and talk directly to the controller working the airspace above them. And sometimes there is an assist controller working next to the tower controller to be used as an extra pair of eyes and to help coordinate when the tower is busy. When there is a go-around, the tower controller will issue appropriate instructions to the aircraft, and the assist, if it's manned, will get on the line and tell the TRACON controller what's going on and ask if they want go around on any specific heading or instruction. Tower then switches that aircraft back to the TRACON controller for re-sequencing, and they come around and try again. Okay, back to the DCA tower and this incident. The assist local controller there in the tower coordinated with TRACON to ask for extended spacing between that first plane, the PSA, and the Republic, the third plane that was coming in for runway 19, so they could squeeze Pat 23's flight into the Pentagon. TRACON told the assistant controller that they would give them some space, and then in the next 3 minutes, this is where the problem happened. Again, simplified, tower asked TRACON for spacing so they could get Pat 23 in. TRACON said they would, and then they put another plane into the space, the Delta flight. And I'm sure the investigation and the docket will look into that. And at 2:28 p.m., the local controller instructed Pat 23 to proceed to the Pentagon via helicopter Route 5, and Pat 23 acknowledged.
Pat 23, proceed Route 5 to Pentagon.
Route 5 to the Pentagon, Pat 23.
And then at 2:31 p.m., the tower controller instructed Pat 23 to report when they had the landing assured, and Pat 23 acknowledged what they will do. Immediately after the response from Pat 23, the tower controller instructed the Delta flight to go around.
Delta 1671, climb maintain 3000, go around 3000.
Going around 3000, Delta 1671.
The Delta crew acknowledged, and at the same time, the assist local controller began coordinating the go-around with TRACON. The prelim report doesn't have the exact times yet for what follows, but I'm sure that they're going to get those. Around this time, Pat 23 had checked in with the Pentagon heliport tower and was attempting to land without a landing clearance. And when the Pentagon controller asked the crew who had cleared them to land, the crew of the Blackhawk advised they were executing a go-around and that DCA tower had cleared them to the helipad. Now, this communication confuses me. In flying, you can get a clearance to approach an airport or heliport in this case from TRACON, but a clearance to land can only be given by the tower for a towered field. If the heliport tower is asking who cleared them to land, why would PAT 23 say that DCA tower had cleared them to the heliport? Maybe military towered heliports have different clearances. I've asked a couple of former Army helicopter pilots, and they were confused as well by PAT 23 flying this mission and not having a landing clearance for the Pentagon. And I'm sure this will also be a point of investigation for the NTSB. Usually, if a VIP transport for the military is en route, why would the Pentagon heliport not know about them? There's some breakdown in communication. And also, for those who might think, well, a helicopter can just hover while they get a clearance, why do they have to go around? Well, hovering can be very difficult or even sometimes dangerous, depending on your weight, the conditions, the winds. Helicopter pilots call it OGE hovering, which is out of ground effect. And that's any hover above the rotor diameter than above the ground. OGE requires significant power and can lead to a disastrous situation called settling with power, also known as vortex ring state. And basically, if the helicopter can't maintain the altitude, it begins to slowly descend into its own rotor wash. And the main rotor blades are now trying to get lift from disturbed airflow, which leads to even less lift, and more power only churns up the air more and makes it worse. Of course, helicopters can and do perform OGE maneuvers all the time, but it increases the risk. And it's always safer for the helicopter to keep moving forward, even slowly, so that the airflow is coming from in front and not being induced from the top. At 2:32 p.m., the third flight, the Republic flight, checked in with the DCA tower inbound on the river visual approach to runway 19.
Tower, Bridge 5825, river visual 19.
PK 25 Washington Tower, pin 170 at 9, runway 19 clear line, traffic is holding in position.
The tower issued the winds and advised of traffic that would be holding in position. Tower cleared them to land runway 19. 1 minute later, the tower controller asked PAT 23 if they were landing assured, and the crew advised them they were landing assured. Simultaneously, according to information provided afterwards, the tower controller saw PAT 23 climb back up above the Pentagon building, and immediately the tower issued a go-around to the Republic flight and instructed them to climb and maintain 3,000 feet and to turn right to heading of 250.
PK 25, go around, climb maintain 3,000.
Going around, climb maintain 3,000, Bridge 5825.
By then, the separation had already been lost and they had come within 0.4 miles and 200 feet. And here's the map provided in the NTSB Prelim Report. The report finishes by talking about how they interviewed everyone on June 15th and that all the equipment was the same as the incident date of May 1st. Then it goes over the weather, which was great. And then the bottom of the report mentions that this is a Class 3 investigation. So the NTSB categorizes the investigations into 4 classes. Class 1 is the most serious. It's reserved for very significant accidents and it involves tons of NTSB and external resources for the investigation. A Class 2 investigation will have a broad scope and will still involve significant resources, but just not as big as a Class 1. Then a Class 3 investigation generally identifies safety issues that reveal the underlying cause of the incident or accident. And basically a Class 3 is an investigation to see what needs to change so that there's not a Class 1 or 2 in the future because of the events in the Class 3. Finally, Class 4 simply identifies the cause of an accident, so a much smaller investigation team and is very limited in scope. Again, this is just one of many, many loss of separation incidences around the airspace of Washington Reagan National. Now, on the positive side of seeing a report generated and an investigation ongoing for this is that the normalization of deviation from standards that has been in place for at least a decade at this airport is now under a microscope. And I do believe that this will lead to changes. And I'm very thankful that this is simply a loss of separation and not some loss of life tragedy. I'm hoping that the FAA and the military will be able to improve the procedures, the conditions in that incredibly complex airspace and do it quickly. Thanks for watching this report. And I want to thank my sponsors that make this reporting possible, like Colton Mortgage. For residential or refi mortgages, check out coltontakingoff.com. It's run by a pilot. Actually, that's his plane. And thanks, Cam, for the heads up on this report. And I've had a few people leave comments wondering where all the aviation interviews and discussions and podcasts have gone that used to be on this channel. And I've moved all of the hardcore aviation content like that to a new channel called In the Hangar, which you can go to by clicking up there in the corner. And if that's for you, make sure you do click and subscribe. We go into in-depth discussions of things that affect pilots and the aviation industry. Thanks again for watching. And if you want to see our previous report on the NTSB's hearing that spread over 3 days and 27 hours, here is the TLDR of those days. Remember, superior judgment trumps superior skills. Take care.